Chapter 1167. After 7 chapters, the God Valley incident has concluded. For me, it more than lived up to expectations, 9 out of 10, because if you want to be stingy, technically nothing is perfect, but also there still are questions that need answering which will affect how I view the incident in hindsight. For example, how the Domi Reversi really works, because that played a major role in Zabek's end. But it's done now, we may revisit it in the future, but for now it's done, and it's time to get back to the Giants. In other news, big news, the production for season 3 of the live action has officially begun, which is going to be assumedly the entirety of and only the Alabasta arc. Season 2 began production in June 2024, so if that's anything to go by, season 3 should be coming out by August 2027 maybe, which actually sounds really good considering that would only be a little over a year after season 2. But back to the topic at hand, chapter 1167. It's back to Harald and Elbaf. The chapter opens 5 years after the God Valley incident, where we see all kinds of different people telling stories about something they encountered, and all of these tales are talking about the same thing. We see Morgan's first interviewing someone who was speaking of a giant shadow that appeared in the mist behind him, and in Impel Down a prisoner says whatever it was sunk his ship with little to no effort. So at this point I'm going to ignore the next panel and what the fisherman has to say for the time being. We know about other shadowy giant entities that roam the seas, and they do so in the Florian Triangle, the most mist-heavy part of the seas. So based on the accounts of that prisoner and that civilian, it sounds like they were describing those massive creatures we saw at the end of Thriller Bark. But from my perspective though, I was never fully convinced that those shadow beings were ever actually real. They were only there as a way for Oda to showcase the mysteriousness and the creepiness of the Florian Triangle. Like, no one truly knows what's lurking in the mist, so people have come up with these fantasies. And I will get back to the fisherman eventually, but on the next page we see that the figure that these stories were describing turned out to be Harald, who was carrying out a mission which is to assist the Marines in secret, discreetly, in defeating pirates. The narrator explains how barely anyone had even seen a giant, so to them this was a monster, and you can't blame him because Harald is a giant amongst giants, and this is also part of his atonement for the 1000 years worth of sins, and we see him cleaving a ship in half. So if that was all the information we were given, I would have come to the conclusion that I was right about those giant shadows not actually existing, and that it was Harald's actions here hunting pirates which gave birth to some myth or conspiracy about some giant figures haunting the Florian Triangle. And as myths and conspiracies go, the truth was inflated and the truth gets lost, meaning Harald goes from being Harald to becoming these Zunisha-sized shadow creatures. But that's not the case, because now, going back to the fisherman, when asked if this was within the Florian Triangle, he said it wasn't. They don't go anywhere near that part of the sea. So with the mention of giant figures in the mist and with a mention of the Florian Triangle, there's no way this isn't also hinting towards those massive shadows. So I think that not only are they real, but they are also going to be relevant in the future. So the new idea I'm going to go with is that at the very least these shadow monsters and the Onigashima skull are one in the same, and that skull has horns, same as Harald, or well, as Harald used to. But the point is now, I think the Florian Triangle shadow beings are going to be connected to the giants' ancient past, maybe even first world level ancient, predating the Void Century, Nika's time maybe. But back to Harald, and based on this as well as the rest of the chapter, it looks as though they have him right where they want him, like a puppet on strings in the palm of their hand. But we also know that, based on the words of Shamrock and Sommers in the present, that elbaf never actually became a member nation. They never actually reached the point where they were brought into the fold. So the way I'm viewing this is that yes, Harald has kind of gone all in now. He's gone off the deep end, done a 360 in a sense, where his hatred of violence and tyranny led him right back to it, which we saw where he beat that other giant into the ground last chapter. And I really like that, because in many stories there are characters who seem to have good intentions at heart, but they are also absolutely crazy. So you wonder how they got to that point, how their ideologies became so twisted. With Harald, we've seen how that's happened, finding no success in his ventures and the death of his best friend, which he himself was indirectly responsible for. It's all or nothing for him, but as for the world government, I think they're still being cautious. They are easing him into the mix, because things could still take a turn for the worst. Everything has gone in their favor, but they can't get too comfortable. Look at what happened when they crossed Zabek. They got through it, but just about. The celestial dragons could have been massacred. Emu themselves had to descend to the lower realm to sort things out, and the entire island collapsed. That incident was one turn away from being a catastrophe for them, and it was already bad enough as it was. Now imagine they did let Elbaf in straight away, but Harald had a change of heart. They now have to deal with someone whose strength is on par with Zabek's, maybe even surpassing it if we go by Zabek's own words, which heavily imply that's the case. Someone that powerful on the inside as well, with the strongest army in the world at his back. Maybe Emu can handle it, I don't know. But how much damage could Harald do before then? Therefore, it makes sense that they are taking things kind of slowly and seemingly conditioning him in a way to show how things work around here. Plus, if you give him what he wants, then what incentive does he have to keep doing what they tell him to do? They can dangle that carrot on the end of the stick in front of him for as long as they want, because as we've said before, he's kind of gone mad in some sense. And we do know that this goes on for a very long time because of how many years pass in this chapter, and the narrator keeps going. He discusses how some of the participants of the God Valley incident went on to make a name for themselves, and like I said, a lot of time is covered in this chapter because we now move to the execution of Roger and the beginning of the Great Pirate Era. Ground Zero, where the Marines are now enlisting giants to bolster their forces. We know John Giant was the first, and we can surmise that many of the members of the Vice Admiral Giant squad are also from Elbaf, and Harald has been called before the Five Elders for the first time, so his work has paid off here, his first big step forward, and they mark him with a mark which is the exact same one we saw on Shanks, who we will definitely get to. It's a tattoo which is part of a three-part system: the shallow or surface sea contract, the deep sea contract, and the sea floor or abyssal contract. Any mention of the abyss or sea floor is going to evoke thoughts of Davy Jones, but I don't think he's relevant here. But they also give him the title of a Blade of God or God's Steel, and we get more information on what that actually means. Less than what I expected though, because I thought since Gunko previously was the only person we knew to have that title, it meant they were someone who was the closest to Emu, or much closer than anyone else, which would work given the fact that Gunko is one of, if not the only handmaid who serves Emu directly. It's actually a lesser title than being a holy knight. It means he's now a supporter to them, their right hand, but not quite an actual knight yet. But it's explained that the surface contract is only a faint tie connection, hence surface level, but the other two are the real deal. Those two contracts bind whoever has them with God, so Emu, meaning there are 13 holy knights in total. I'm too lazy to go back and count all of the members we've been introduced to since the God Valley incident, but I'm going to assume that all of those we've been introduced to are still alive in the present. And Nusjuro even continues to say Harald could become one of them as well on the day Elbaf is brought into the fold. So they've basically set him a target that appears attainable for him to keep going for. But I did say before that I'm sure they never intend to honor this agreement. Dangling the carrot, make the fool dance. Reminds me of Oden in a way. At least when Oden was dancing, he was saving lives as he did it, but Harald here is being played like a fiddle. But this does show that the average celestial dragons have no input on who becomes a holy knight, and the group isn't exclusively made up of celestial dragons either, which makes sense since Killingham is a fishman, and they would never allow that. At least the elders have enough brain cells to be above that kind of petty racism. Maybe that's why he first appeared in his own form. He stays in that form of a mythical creature in the Holy Land to just avoid any unnecessary drama. So from that we now know why there was a summoning circle in Elbaf in Ost Castle, but looking a bit deeper, the meaning behind each rank of mark. Abyssal being the highest, you can put together that whoever has it has full access and control to the Abyss teleportation ability. They can create circles and use the circle to summon others with the marks. Deep, the middle rank, I would guess they can only do one of those two things but not both, and since those two contracts apparently bind them to Emu, I assume since whoever has one of those contracts is an official holy knight, they would also have have the immortality, so the binding aspect would work since it's already been theorized that these guys are tethered to Emu in some way. And Shallow, Harald's rank and the lowest one, I don't think they can use the Abyss abilities at all. I think that having the Shallow mark only means that they can be summoned and others can teleport to their location, and that's it. So it doesn't give Harald himself any power, but it does make things a lot easier for the government in terms of keeping track of him. And going along with this idea, maybe Harald never agreed to have the summoning circle placed in his throne room, but the knights put it there themselves and made a move after his critical error, meaning the Shallow mark looks to be less of a boost and more of a way for them to keep him in check. So to reiterate, the Shallow mark means others can teleport to you and they can teleport you to them, but you yourself cannot do anything. You aren't given any of the actual abilities, nor do they have the immortality obviously, but compare that to Summer's mark or tattoo, which we see is much more complex, so I would guess that's an abyssal mark, the highest tier, which he has as one of the senior members of the Holy Knights, and maybe someone like Killingham, who they trust but is still relatively young, has the deep mark, the intermediary one. Next we move to a brand new location in the Holy Land, the Knight's Temple Shangara. Someone else can decipher that name because again I'm too lazy, but we see a now middle-aged Garling who has the title of the Captain of the Knights. As Harald is welcomed, I say welcomed because even though it's a brief conversation, it seems very amicable, no hostility. Also Summers and Shamrock are here, so it makes sense that they were more in the know about Harald in the present story since they were with him from the beginning, kind of, if you want to count this as a new beginning for Harald. So Garling explains what's expected of him and gives him a long distance transponder snail so he can call, and I just get the feeling this detail of a long distance snail is important, like something to do with Mosa, who is very relevant because next we see Harald drinking with Neptune, who really was one of the boys back in the day. He wasn't a pirate, he did not sail the seas, but everyone had to pass through Fishman Island to cross the red line, so it's no wonder he was close to all of these guys, which includes Harald, who he's drinking with here, who he's telling about his troubles with Loki, and Neptune brings up the prophecy of his daughter who will soon be born, and that is none other than Shirahoshi, and he jokes about Loki and her getting engaged. Even him saying just that set off alarm bells in my head. Like, is the Mosa thing being hinted at? But there's no need for the alarm bells because Harald refers to her as Mosa Mosa, shaggy, hairy. Shirahoshi is Mosa. Confirmed, and I would say that I knew it, but that would be very shameless since another 5 million people also speculated that Mosa was Shirahoshi, but on top of that, me and 5 million other people were speculating about 5 different people at the exact same time. But what I can say that I put together myself, even if other people also did, is that I did connect the dots of the official referring to Mosa as Shaggy, since that was one interpretation of what Mosa meant, and that Shaggy or hairy was what Roger called Shirahoshi back when Charlie predicted her birth 10 years in advance. So there wasn't really a bad option for Mosa's identity other than Yarul, because with the way Mosa, now Shirahoshi, was speaking, the whiplash of thinking it was a girl only for it to be a 400-year-old who's into older women would have been crazy. But I'm a big fan of it being Shirahoshi, mainly because of their completely opposite personalities, but also they are both pink-haired royalty. Lola, another pink-haired lady, she had her chance but she rejected our boy, so Loki now has an ancient weapon on his side, and when you think about it that way, you wonder what the deeper meaning is behind these two being connected like this. And one question I have is that Shirahoshi thanked Loki the last time we heard them speaking as if something big was going on, and then she just cut off the call, so I wonder what that's about. Is there something going on in Fishman Island right now? Back to Elbaf. For the first time this chapter, we see Harald meeting Saul, with Ripley also present as we see the birth of the idea of the Walrus School. So this was one of the first things we ever learned about Harald, that he wanted to start the school, and back then it was still more popular to view him as the villain since we barely knew anything other than this and the fact he worked with the world government in some way, which we now know he isn't. Very far from that, but even so, big dreams but a very narrow view, very tunnel vision. And now moving to Fisher Tiger's escape from Marie-Joie, only he didn't get out on his own but rather a masked member of the Holy Knights breaks his explosive collar and points him in the direction of the armory, and it's obviously Shanks because there's no other person in Marie-Joie who would actively free a dirty fishman, and we get some answers on Shanks' presence later. But remember this detail, that Fisher Tiger ripped off the bandages bandages from Shanks' face, since we see blood pouring out of there, the same location of a certain 3-clawed scar. We also see the Boa sisters and Koala as well here, so on that note, it seems as though there is something that was misinterpreted by the fanbase, which is big because this community is on top of everything, because a story as dense as this requires us to be, but it relates to Fisher Tiger freeing the slaves. He did not climb the red line, but it's not a retcon, at least to me it isn't, because we only heard about Fisher Tiger climbing the red line from Boa Hancock when she was telling Luffy about her past, with Tiger being the savior of this story, and I don't think anyone else ever mentioned him doing this other than Hancock here. So recapping the timeline, with this new knowledge, he was captured as a slave, helped free by Shanks, and he saved the others because he couldn't bear to leave them there. Then he met with Neptune and Otohime but didn't tell them about his time in slavery. Then he formed the Sun Pirates, and it was only on his deathbed where he revealed the truth. So him climbing the red line was always a fabricated story, which was also meant to hide the fact he was a slave. Who started this legend? Who knows? Maybe it just became a thing because the slaves, like Boa and her sisters, wouldn't really have a reason to think a slave was able to break free himself before freeing the rest. And I do like this, since it makes Fisher Tiger seem even less like a typical hero, you know, the mighty Fisher Tiger who climbed the red line. No, he was a lowly slave this whole time, just as they were. So the red line thing is a canon lie, if that makes sense, to propagate the idea of Tiger breaking into Marijwa rather than being a slave who broke out. This is really funny to me as well though, since people have tried in the past to use Fisher Tiger's exploits as a way to downplay Dragon and what he's trying to do with the Revolutionary Army. And while I don't mean to diminish what Tiger did, here he was also freed just as much as he was able to escape, but the point is that the man who freed him only lived all those years ago during the God Valley incident, thanks to the man who Fisher Tiger's actions after this have been used to talk down on Dragon. So it all comes full circle in a sense. Now back to Harald in the Holy Land, where Garling introduces him to his other son Shanks. We are getting answers to what Shamrock was talking about when he said his estranged brother returned once but preferred the lower realm. Garling explains that they were separated and how he has potential equal to Shamrock's. I don't know about potential, but at least in the present, for me Shamrock is powerful, but he is not on Shanks' level. Interestingly, Harald said he'd seen Shanks before and he felt the same when he met Shamrock, but I can't think of a time when this could have happened other than if Harald met Roger at some point before his execution or before he became king of the pirates, where he would have seen Shanks on board the Oro Jackson. But the response Shanks gives to this is extremely cold, talking down on the king of the giants like he's a bug, just as any other celestial dog would, with that left eye bandaged, and it seems as though he's now living in Marijwa with his father and brother, while wearing the appropriate attire, much like Shamrock's. And while these panels will fuel many agendas, especially since they are canon images, of course Shanks wasn't there to actually join his family as a celestial dog, but he's doing his damnedest to make sure it seems that way, as he feigns ignorance, pretending to be up to finding the culprit who freed Fisher Tiger, with Shamrock telling him he should wait until he is all healed up, and he's doing a good job if you ask me. It may not be who he really is, but those celestial genes are coming in clutch for him right now with the words he's saying. And back to that left eye, with him now masquerading as a celestial dog, talking about his disgust of having lived 24 years amongst filth essentially, as he tries to gather information. We now know that this event where Blackbeard scarred him was within the 4-year span of him starting his crew 19 years ago and here 15 years ago, and I would say it's closer to the 15 years ago, so here, because we know he's now living with his family, but we can put together that this was a recent thing since Harald was just meeting him now. I'm guessing the incident where he helped Fisher Tiger was the moment he arrived in Marijwa, since he looked to be wearing his classic cloak, and he allowed Fisher Tiger to rip off the bandages on his face so he could use that as a cover-up for how he actually got those scars, as he wouldn't want to reveal any more info to his father and brother than he has to. Plus, from the way he's speaking to Shamrock, where he seems so energetic about learning about Marijwa and the Holy Land, you can put together this was a very recent arrangement. And he also has the same shallow surface sea mark as Harald, so we now know what that mark on his arm was when he was chilling with Gabon, and it was theorized about that when he lost his arm to the Lord of the Coast, it was a purposeful choice on his part to rid him of whatever effects the tattoo had. And based on my idea earlier of it not giving him any abilities but rather just tethering him to the other knights to the Holy Land, it would fit with that idea that he allowed the Lord of the Coast to take that arm, since if he chose chose to remain in the lower realm, and the elders gave him this mark as a way to monitor him in a sense. Of course, he would want to get rid of it. And at this point, there's only a couple years to go before he meets Luffy. The main story begins and all that drama by Windmill Village goes down. And for me, this all but confirms that what Roger told him after returning from Laugh Tale was the truth of his celestial dragon lineage, which is why he started to cry, and that's why Shanks didn't go after the One Piece, because after that talk, after what Roger told him, which may have included other stuff as well, he had work to do, information to uncover, because remember again, Shanks steals the Gum Gum fruit, the Nika fruit, very soon after this, which he was able to pull off maybe because of what Roger told him and what he learned in Marijua. But one more thing is that Shanks told Gabon he wanted to discuss something with Harald, but he couldn't since they were in Marijua, and he also couldn't tell him on Elbaf since Harald died. So you wonder what was so important. Maybe it was again something to do with Nika, since Shanks went after the fruit specifically, and it's known the giants literally worship the guy. Or was it something else entirely? But going back to the mark, the contract, I have a question, which is, did Shanks know about it before he went in for the mission, or did he only find out while he was there? At which point he could only accept it because he had to keep up appearances and not risk being caught out, meaning his arm became a necessary sacrifice as soon as he was given the tattoo. But during all of this time, I wonder what his crew is doing. You know, did he set them on another mission that they need to complete while he's doing this? Meanwhile, back on Elbaf, Ida is very ill and refusing to contact Harald as to not disturb his mission, even as the doctor is trying to persuade her otherwise, trying to use her love for him to essentially guilt trip her. But rightfully so, since although they aren't married, they are family, and we even learn Harald constantly went to petition to the elders of Elbaf, not the 5 elders, to permit their marriage. And as we've gotten used to with Ida, she smiles while being very appreciative about what she has. Loki's causing a ruckus outside, and because of this situation with the doctor being unable to cure her or help her, a healer is needed, leading to Hiruden and his crew setting out to sea in search of one. That's how Ida's first son reacts. Emphasis on first son because Hiruden is no longer her only child. But his reaction is to go out and find a cure for his mother. And as for Loki in this situation, we see him having a conversation with another giant from the alcohol village, the home village of his biological mother Estrid, and this giant spills absolutely everything. He talks about his hatred over the idea of an outsider like Ida becoming the queen. But let's go over her time on Elbaf. The elders of Elbaf blocked her from marrying Harald, and they introduced him to Estrid instead. But after she died, Ida started her bar. She never became a queen, nor did she act like one. She started her own business and carried her own weight. I don't know about the whole alcohol village, but I'm assuming this guy's family, Estrid's family, might feel this way as well, but they are on their own because it's clear to see how well liked, incredibly well liked Ida was by everybody else, including other villages like the fisherman village, which I'm putting together from the fact that these guys let her shout at them in chapter 1157. But this guy thought Loki would be on his side, and for that specifically I don't blame him given Loki's past attitude and actions. So he confesses he poisoned Ida, saying her fate is sealed. Big mistake, my friend, giant mistake, pun very much intended. Maybe he only did it now because Harald's prolonged absence meant he was not there to protect her, an outsider. We see Ida speaking on how she views Loki as just as much her son as Hiruden, and the end of the chapter sees Loki seething in anger and destroying the alcohol village while holding up that very same giant by the neck, hoping Ida won't die, recalling what Estrid did to him when he was born. Even if Ida is not an Elbaf native, Loki has something to say. He proclaims loudly and proudly that Ida is his only mother. This outsider is mother to 2 princes of Elbaf, the future of this country. This was the moment I was hoping for, that this flashback would lead to. With all the care Ida gave him, Loki would finally accept her as his family as well. And that's why I said Ida no longer has only one son, because even though she thought of him as her son all this time, we needed Loki to accept that as well. But also Loki's whole deal since he was a kid was how he was alone, had no one to help him, and I like the idea of him slowly realizing that he did have people around him who cared for him, or he cared for, or maybe just people around him in general, like Ida, like his father, who should have been around more, but he still cared for his sons. Hiruden, yes, they fought and argued, and Loki being framed split them apart even more, but they're still brothers. Mato, even the little girl who would become the bartender in Ida's bar, even even Zebek, who Loki looked up to, Mosa, who we now know as Shirahoshi, a true friend who he can talk to, and the latest of those friends, Luffy, and maybe the rest of the Straw Hats as well eventually. He had and has people around him. So we end 1 year before the fateful day where Harald dies, Ida is poisoned, and the death flags have been raised. But it's still possible that she is alive in the present, since we know Hyrudin went out to sea to find a healer. Maybe Ida was also eventually taken out to sea to be cured, although I don't know why she wouldn't return. Maybe because she really no longer felt welcome here. They succeeded in pushing her out. But now in this flashback, it's been 23 years since the God Valley incident. That's longer than the time between Roger's execution and the present, but we still got a ton of information. Harald accidentally giving birth to the legend of the Florian Triangle monsters, Shanks on the move, Loki finally has a real mother. I reckon we get one more chapter and then we reach the day 14 years ago, where we will finally get back to the stuff Loki is telling us about, not the narrator. And I suspect it's going to be similar to, not as long as, but similar to how the God Valley incident, a one-day event, was spread across multiple chapters. We'll see the truth, we'll see, I hope we'll see, the Sun World. How the heck we still haven't after all this time is wild. But Loki does jump down from above when Harald summons him, so maybe he was up there. And speaking of Harald, we may get to see him regain his sanity and screw up the world government's plans. There's also the possibility of seeing the rest of what Shanks gets up to if this flashback continues past Harald's death, since Shanks was the one who captured Loki out at sea. But at the very least, from where we are right now, I think it's safe to say that we are closer to the end of this flashback than we are to the beginning.